Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Book Passage. It is so fantastic to see a full house in an independent bookstore. Thank you for coming out. Simon and I were talking. I want to mention about his PBS series really quickly. Tuesday, March 25th at 8 p.m. is the first part of the series.
So two parts.
First two parts. Thank you. So be sure that you know about that, and it will continue on Tuesdays after that.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay, so let's get started here. My name is Melissa Cesaro, and I have the honor of introducing historian, documentarian, professor, and author Simon Schama. Simon has authored 16 books and written and hosted more than 40 documentaries on art, history, and literature. You may recognize him from one of his engaging series on the BBC, PBS, or the History Channel, or you may have seen him with Stephen Colbert. You also may have read one of his many fascinating books, such as Rough Crossing, The Power of Art, The Embarrassment of Riches, or The Landscape and Memory. But Simon is here this evening with his new book, The Story of Jews, Finding the Words. This is actually the first book of a 2-volume story which covers Jewish history from 1000 BC to 1492 AD. And what's especially compelling about this book is the passion that Simon brings to unraveling this very complex and enduring history of Jewish culture. Through his narrative, he has constructed a bridge connecting Jews and the non-Jews and reminding us of our shared humanity, that we are all connected. This is also, I think, a history book that should be required reading. And we are just so thrilled to have you here with us, Simon. Please join me in welcoming the dashing Simon Schama.
What a lovely introduction. It's very nice to be called dashing. That hasn't happened for a long time. I'm not going to dash out. And you've all turned your cell phones off. Actually, my favorite is when, I don't know how many of you have graduated from the fabulous spectacle that must still be running called Spamalot, where King Arthur comes to the front of the stage at the beginning and says, I want everybody to turn their cell phones on because the show is complete rubbish. And don't do that, please. Yes, indeed. Story of the Jews. I mean, why did I do it? Well, of course, to correct stereotypes, to begin with. Which reminds me of Moshe and Jaime, who were passing the church on a Sunday, and the sign said, converts needed, $50 bonus for signing. So Jaime says to Moshe, this is a terrible thing, you know. And Moshe said, well, times are hard, yeah, it is terrible. And so I'm very shocked. And he said, well, you know, how bad can it be, really? You know, the Moranos did it all the time, $50 is $50. So Moshe said, well, I'm really shocked, but if you split it, you know, I won't shop you to the rabbi. So Moshe goes in, and 20 minutes later he comes out, and Jaime says, so how was it? And Moshe says, well, it's all right. And Jaime said, so, you know, my 25, and Moshe says, that's all you Jews think about, money, money, money. So Chassid walks into a bar in New York with a parrot on his shoulder, and the bartender says, where'd you get that? And the parrot said, Brooklyn, there are thousands of them. Quite enough of this. You can, if you're not suffering enough already. There is, one thing Melissa didn't say is, I did an hour of stand-up comedy in Chicago towards even more people than are in this room, if that's conceivable. And I was actually asked to do, a good friend of mine, Lawrence Weschler, who was a colleague of mine in New Yorker, runs, I think he still does, the Chicago Festival of the Humanities. And he had a 1 year, it was always themed, it was going to be laughter. And he called me up and said, oh, Simon, you know more Jewish jokes than anybody else. And I said, you come and talk about Jewish humour. And I thought, okay, fine. And I made a huge mistake of reading Sigmund Freud, jokes and their relation to the unconscious. He is no Jerry Seinfeld, I have to say. There is one joke in the book, and it's not a very good one, you don't want to hear it. So I procrastinated. I thought, well, is there anything less funny than a professor coming to talk about Jewish humour? And I thought, no, there isn't. So, but I so procrastinated that I shouldn't do it. And then I thought, oh, on the other hand. So I called Renard, and he answered the phone. And before I said anything else, I said, so there was a rabbi, a Catholic, and a priest and a pastor, and they want to find out, as was the case in medieval disputations, as you will learn from the book and from Programme 2, about which is the superior religion, and they were all in the national park. So the thing to do, of course, is to have competitive conversion of an available bear. And they all agreed to this, and they agreed to meet back at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and see who's actually been successful. And the pastor arrives and the priest arrives, and the priest says, so how'd you go? And the pastor said, well, he said the bear was very hot, and there happened to be a river, and they dumped him, and he was baptized, and he belongs to Jesus now. How do you get on? And the priest said, well, he was very hungry. My bear was very, very hungry, and God provided. I had the host with me, communion wafer, and the bear took a nibble, and he belongs to St. Peter. And he said, where's my show? And that moment, this pathetic figure comes stumbling through the undergrowth in miserable condition and said, boys, on second thought, circumcision was not the way to go. All right, class, settle down. All right. Serious. There are serious reasons why I took on this hubris-laden, or one should say in Jewish terminology, chutzpah-heavy project. And I was born in 1945 and in London, and two kinds of histories have been absolutely flattened by the war, but not, of course, annihilated: Jewish history and English history, British history. My father, I remember, one of the first things I remember about his capacious bookshelf, that he was very much an autodidact, whose identity was indivisibly formed of his Englishness and his Jewishness. He read to us Dickens, actually read it out loud after dinner, which was a wonderful thing to do. And the thing that I remember on his bookshelf, the books that were next to each other were Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples, and Chaim Weizmann's wonderful book, if you've not read it ever, it may not even be in print except in Israel, called Trial and Error, his memoir. Weizmann, a tragic figure in lots of ways, a noble but ultimately tragic figure whose life really fell into ruin because of the enmity between the Zionist movement and the British, especially over the White Paper of 1939, which I talked about in the last programme. So I had the sense that already as a kid, when you walked around the ruins by my dad, that history was not a stroll down memory lane. There's nothing wrong with escapist history, I guess. Downtoniana. I really yearn to remake that Jewish style and call it sort of Downton Rabbi. Very unlikely to happen. But it very often David Grossman and Amos Oz, who wrote a great book with his daughter Fania called Jews and Words, and David Grossman's extraordinary story, Sea Under Love. It's almost commonplace in Jewish life that history is a way of itself of surviving, that when everything else is taken away from you, often, your family, but also territory, safety, political institutions. What made the Jews were not unique in suffering what they suffered in terms of uprooting and persecution and oppression, but I think probably Jews have been special in the intensity with which and the relentlessness with which they've gone through this, which isn't to say that all Jewish history is, as my illustrious predecessor at Columbia said, lacrimoused, tear-stained. An awful lot of it is, but I try in these programs to do the celebration. In fact, program number 2 begins with that amazing verse in Deuteronomy, the recapitulation of all the rest of the Torah before it, where the verse says, God speaking, says, I've set before you on this day a blessing and a curse, death and life, therefore choose life. And I've tried very much to keep faith with the choice of life. So the Jews are not unique. What has been unique about the Jewish story, I think, actually has been the conviction that even when everything else is annihilated, including your nearest and dearest, the story goes on, that you can endure through telling the story, through reading the Talmud, reading the Torah, not just the Bible, being bonded into a community of memory. This I can't tell you how profound and recurring this is, all through Jewish history. To give you one short story. In 1940, somebody with whom I deeply identify and rather revere, called Ringelblum, who was a rather left-wing, not particularly God-fearing, Yiddish-speaking Polish Jew on the left, not particularly Zionist, but not hostile to Zionism. Ringelblum was a pupil, those of you who are learned Jews, and I've learned Corte Madera is full of learned non-Jews and Jews, will know that the great figure in this rather leftish, secularist history of the Jewish national identity, a term fraught with complications, was a man called Simon Dubnow, and Emanuel Ringelblum was his kind of star student. Dubnow is dead. Ringelblum has worked on collecting Yiddish stories from around the shtetl world of Poland. And in 1940, very quickly, he understands, after the ghetto is established, this huge population crammed into 2% of the city, tiny space, obviously going to be doomed, and he's going to be doomed with it. He understands that it's important to create an historical memory. So he creates something with his own colleagues and kids, and sometimes just school kids, called Oynek Shabbos in Yiddish, the kind of festival of the coming Sabbath, the eve of the Sabbath. And what Oynek Shabbos was a kind of a collection of documents from the Häufen, from the tenement flats of now ghetto Warsaw, which, being Jews, had committee meetings every single evening, which they argued, why does a Jew always answer a question with the question, why not, And the Häufen had their own tragic but wonderful archives about how much medicine do we have, how much food do we have, how many children are dying of various things, how many bodies were there last night, and so on. So it's very, very powerful stuff, and they collected all this material day by day and worked on it and created a kind of instant archive, knowing they were going to perish. One of the Ringelblum's friend and ultimately the person responsible for the endurance of the archive was another wonderful man called Emanuel Lichtenstein. And he said he knew he was going to die in the Warsaw Uprising, the first uprising of any kind against the Nazis in April. We're coming up to it, the anniversary now, in April 1943. And Lichtenstein said he wished he could be there at the day when this archive will be uncovered after the defeat of the Nazis. And what they did in the end, when they knew the end was nigh, they buried these archives in milk churns, in these big kind of steel, I don't know what the material was, zinc, it wasn't aluminum, but they buried them in a series of milk churns. And one, miraculously, of their group survived, a man called Hirschwasser, and in 1950 took people back to where, and they unearthed this extraordinary archive, which is in the Warsaw Jewish Museum, about to be much more magnificent and extraordinary, opening next year, I think. There are still some of these churns left, said to be buried underneath the Chinese embassy, but don't look for the Chinese to demolish their own foundations in the name of Jewish history anytime soon. So this urge to really preserve memory and storytelling is very, very deep, and is constant, and I could give you a story after story through the millennia, and it made me want to think about the nature of storytelling itself in Jewish life, as well as history. So I was very struck, and I'm going to show you the opening of the series in just a second. In a way, the way I didn't really have time to do this, many things I don't have time to do in a film, 3,000 years in 5 hours. I took the deal from the BBC, but it's an insane enterprise. The words of Samuel Beckett, fail better, came to me over and over and over again. Yes. And the way I deal with the Bible is not to start with the patriarchs and did they ever live or did they not, or so on, but much more. I was very interested in the parts of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, where the star of the story is the book itself, where it's its own feature, there's this extraordinary, I went and read the whole thing, and a very large part, nearly all of the Mishnah and large parts of the Talmud. And there's this extraordinary moment, I don't know how many, if I was talking to a proper audience, like Pentecostal evangelicals in Texas, they would all put their hands up when I ask who's read the book of Ezekiel lately. Yeah, look, Corte, Madera. Good. I'll believe you. There was an amazing moment in the book of Ezekiel where an angel appears, and Ezekiel is, as you know, son of man. It is again, it's very, very Northern California, the book of Ezekiel. It's fantastically creepy. And it's the only one written in the first person, I, son of man. And people would go out and people appear to the prophet Ezekiel, who's out of his skull and all kinds of visions, even by the standards of the Old Testament. And an angel appears with a copy of the Bible and says, "Son of man, digest this. Eat it." And Ezekiel says, "Oh, you know, I have digested all of the content of the Torah." And the angel says, "No, you don't understand. I mean, stick it in your mouth, chomp, chomp, munch, munch, munch." And Ezekiel does as he was told. And he literally digests physically the substance of the book, at which point he is then certified to actually speak the words of the Bible. So these two functions of it reminds me of my father, lovely Arthur, who used to say a Jew's best weapon is his mouth. My father was a street corner orator at the time of the black shirt fascists in London, was beaten up regularly, but he always came back with his mouth, and he taught me to be a little kind of a sort of freak child debater. I would go around at the age of 11 with my knitted white on white tie and shirt and do, should Britain abandon the independent nuclear deterrent? My dad would stand at the back going, "Louder, Simon, louder," which is one of his mottos in life, really. And so there are lots of passages in the Bible where the Bible is its own star. There's another extraordinary passage in the Book of Kings where Josiah, there's renovations constantly going on in what's now fairly crumbly First Temple before the Babylonian destruction. And they're constantly, and what a surprise, the renovators and the priests find a copy of the Bible and it's brought forth, and this is a kind of miracle because King Josiah has come after a long reign of idolatrous backsliding under, I think, the reign of his grandfather, King Manasseh. And so again, the book is a bit like, Raiders of the Lost Ark or something, miraculously discovered. There's another great informative moment, Karen Armstrong's books have wondered about this, when the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, when the miracle under the aegis of the benign Persian King Cyrus, the walls of Jerusalem are reconstructed and the second temple begins to be built. The crucial moment where Jews are back in Jerusalem and are really doing what Jews are supposed to do is when Ezra builds a wooden platform next to the Watergate and the walls of Jerusalem and begins to read the Torah out loud. And there's a back and forth. It's almost, it's a public act. And those of you who know Hebrew will know that every Shabbat we talk about the Kriyat Torah, which means the reading of the Torah, but it means reading out loud. Jews, my father was right, the Jews are a kind of loud and talky religion. So I was, as I was saying, interested in this relationship between the word and endurance. And what the Jews did that was unique, again, to recapitulate that first point, after a lengthy digression, watch me digress, surely not, is that we make the word portable. If you think about other religions, Mesopotamian religion, Greek religion, it's fixed in statuary, in temples. And what the Jews do is actually make form in the shape of the scroll, and pots that carry the scroll, carts that carry the pots that can actually be carried around. Judaism is above all a suitcase-ready religion, really. We don't assume that catastrophe lurks around the corner, but you better be prepared for it when it happens. And there are many points in the book, in particular in the Middle Ages, where the Talmud in particular is put on trial, and in one egregiously horrible moment in 1240 in Paris, all the sacred books of the Jews, with the Talmud as the kind of featured demon in the eyes of the Catholic Church, are burned for day after day after day on the Place de Grève, the executioner spot in Paris. And it didn't matter, of course, because there are always going to be other copies of the Scrolls of the Law, and most of the copies are carried up here in heads, in memory. We are the only religion that actually requires people to remember. Zachor, says the book of Exodus. Zachor, remember, says the Haggadah every Passover night, every Seder night. So I'll just show you the other thing I should say before I preface just the kind of very generalized opening of the program. Two things, I guess, is that it was generated it was provoked by the BBC. The preface of the book will tell you about, I have written another book of Jewish history a long time ago, called Two Rothschilds in the Land of Israel. If any of you really need to know about avocado yields in the 1930s, that's your book. People were unduly kind to it, but it was a sort of nerve-wracking. I did it at the behest of Victor Rothschild, one of the most brilliant and dangerous people I've ever known in my life, Lord Rothschild, who once actually, I was in charge of an archive, and I'll tell you about that another time if Melissa ever invites me back. One time when I was a bit laggard in surrendering prose about this archive, Victor Rothschild, who would seduce you with glasses of wine almost as fine as the one I'm holding. And he said, "Simon, do you know what our family motto is?" And I couldn't remember that moment. And he slapped his hand on his fine mahogany desk and said, "Service. And by God, we get it." I had mixed feelings about. Mostly I had mixed feelings about. Historians do tend to divide into two kinds. Those who write kind of their own history, the kind of genealogy of how we got to be us, wonderful or not, and who have a kind of very close relationship with the subject matter. And those of us who really are kind of wanderers, or wandering Jew in history, and for whom history is always a kind of an encounter, as W.H. Auden said, breaking bread with the dead, but the people who are emphatically not like ourselves. There's an act of strenuous, imaginative outreach that takes place in his great historical writing, I think. So I kind of wanted to write about cultures that weren't mine, the Dutch, French in particular, eventually the United States. But gradually I kept on sort of coming back, so hence the great British project, American Policy Project, and eventually this one. And it was generated by the BBC, and there are only 250,000 Jews in Britain. Nearly 4 million people saw the first episode of this series. And because Jewish history, for the non-Jewish world, this is somewhat true in America as well, is so dominated by the Shoah, by the Holocaust, and by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it is very difficult in both cases to find a point of invitational access, I think, for a non-Jewish readership. Either the strenuous polemics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict takes over totally, and passions are exercised, and it becomes a dialogue of the deaf, or else there is this nervousness in the face of the Shoah, entirely understandably, in that people feel what is there to do except lament and regret, and what you can do. There's a sort of worry about treading on the necks of the dead, really, the ashes of the dead. So I wanted to give a broader, richer point of entry, and I begin, as you'll see, in the sort of very general opening, the very first episode, by simply a parade of faces. I knew I wanted to do this. I actually wanted to do it in a rather Richard Avedon, who's a friend of mine, way of these beautiful black and white photographs that we would take of different kinds of Jewish faces. Because again, I think a misapprehension is that Jews are sort of, those who are most conspicuously Jewish are the most kind of eccentric to look at, with sidelocks and the whole, Polish Hasidic rig. And, there are 250,000 Jews in Israel who come from tropical Africa and South Asia and North Africa. At least that, and it's an extraordinary number, and there are very large communities of black Jews in America now, and so I just really wanted to do a kind of picture parade of different types of Jews, and you'll see, and then say what we had in common. The only other thing I would say, I think in advance of this little clip, is say that, when thinking about the dependence of Jews on words, I thought, well, this is incredibly good radio, basically. And, but one of the things, I knew a bit about Jewish art, and it isn't an oxymoron. But what I wasn't quite clear about was how incredibly important the world of images is in, for example, in early synagogues. I'll talk about that to a question if you like. And we show in episode 2 this spectacular mosaic floor. Virtually all synagogues we know about from late antiquity, that's to say, shortly after the destruction of the temple through to the 6th century AD or CE, were covered in images. The second commandment was interpreted as a prohibition on sculpture, not on mosaic, not on even human body or the human face. So if you hear someone say we don't do images in synagogue, they're historically quite wrong about that. One place we couldn't go and film is the great synagogue of Diaspora. It's kind of a ruin, and I have a horrible feeling it's now a complete ruin. But in the Damascus Museum, there are, and just go online and see these pictures, they're also illustrated in the book. But we couldn't go and film because of the Civil War, and I wanted to recklessly charter a helicopter because he wouldn't let me. But it's something like 50 spectacular wall paintings, every single wall surface of the Diaspora synagogue, which is 3rd century AD, very, very early indeed, are covered with scenes from the Old Testament, very, very beautiful scenes. So at the same time that Christian iconography is being created, Jewish iconography is actually being created. So that was a big surprise, but so it became, I hope, gripping, sort of entertaining, educating, gripping television. But I did want to do something with the nature of words itself. And somebody introduced me to somebody who had been very religious and was no longer quite so religious, and he had been a scribe of the Torah. And he was an exquisite calligrapher called Josh Baum. And Josh and I talked about a great pre-Kabbalistic book called the Sefer Yetzirah. Any of you know about that, class? No Kabbalists here?
Could you say that again?
The Sefer Yetzirah, 6th century, the book of creation. And its principal founding myth, and it is before the Zohar was written, is that God creates the world out of letters, out of Hebrew letters. It is an adorable fancy, perfect for book passage. And so Josh became a calligrapher, our Torah scribe and our animator. And the titles that you'll see at the end of this clip have essentially people being made out of letters, and then people, little Jews, who lie down and become part of the book again. So let's just run this. And make Zach finally thinks, oh cool, when's he going to do it? How's that sound, Zach? Good, thank you. Oh, help! We've all got jaundice. Okay, stop.
And so is this.
Okay.
This is you.
Can you run it? Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
I'll be accused of jaundiced opinions, actually. Sorry about that. Okay, can we start? It started, okay. And then we had acid drop yellow. That looks like me not with jaundice, so that's good. Can you roll it back? Yes. There we go. Okay.
This is a Jew. And so is this.
Did we get rid of the transition? Don't worry if you can't. Don't worry.
And this. And this. So am I. So what, if anything, do we have in common? Not the colour of our skin. Not the languages we speak. The tunes we sing. The food we eat. Not our opinions. We're a fiercely argumentative lot. Not even the way we pray, assuming we do. What ties us together is a story kept in our heads and hearts, a story of suffering and resilience, endurance and creativity. It's the story that made me want to be a historian in the first place. For I understood when I was quite small that there were two special things about the Jews, that we'd endured for over 3,000 years despite everything that had been thrown at us, and that we had an extraordinarily dramatic story to tell, and somehow that these two things were connected, that we told our story to survive. We are our story.
Good, there it is, thank you. That's just one of the things that in this project to kind of reach out beyond the Jewish world, because I mean there are things I hope in the book and the program which will come as a surprise even to came as a surprise to me, for example. I'm not going to show you a long sequence, but it features heavily in the first program about this extraordinary colony of Jewish mercenary soldiers in Elephantine. And the pretty much at what used to be the border between Egypt and Nubia, opposite Aswan, where this it was not just mercenary soldiers, but actually their families. It's again the time of the Persian Empire, and the Persian rulers, when they wanted, not all Jews have been intellectuals and psychoanalysts and piano players and lawyers and doctors. Though sometimes I think actually you could write the entire history of the Jews just in a book called Jewish Doctors. So, you know the story about the first Jewish president, President Goldblatt, you must know. And so he's finally, he's elected president. He says, "Mum, you've got to come to the inauguration." And Hetty says, "That's a long way. I've got well, you spend all you like, and Air Force One come and get you." So she finally goes, and he's about to take the oath on the Capitol steps, and Hetty is sitting there quite proud. She nudges her neighbour, and she says, "See that man there?" She says, "Yes, yes." She said, "His brother is a doctor." Not all Jews. Some of them are benchdarkers, as we say in Yiddish. And if you wanted a tough guy to monitor the frontier, then you called for the Judean troop. It's called in Aramaic the Haila HaYehuda, and Aramaic was a kind of word. But there's an extraordinary. I won't give the whole story, but there was an extraordinary find of papyrus documents at the end of the 19th century, which opened the Bible, for all its indispensable wonderfulness, doesn't tell us anything really about the day-to-day society of how Jews live. So it's a great irony that the first time we have documents about weddings, about slave girls being koshered up, about how you could and couldn't celebrate Passover, and this is a community in Egypt, remember, and is this extraordinary document of papyri and broken fragments. My favourite is actually a document which I begin the whole book with, actually, so I so loved it. Where a dad, a father, also living in Egypt, and we're again in the middle of the 5th century BCE, at the time when much of the Bible is being written, and particularly the Ezra and Nehemiah chapters, books. And the father's name, I can't actually remember the father's name, oh yeah, it's Osiah, it's like my father's name, I can't remember that. And the son, who's the soldier boy, is called Shalom, which is my Hebrew name is Shalom. So it's kind of Aramaic version of my own name, so I immediately felt a bit bonded to this family. And the father had promised, he's heard that his son is going to have a bad posting down south, heading for Nubia, almost certainly. And he promised to get him A, back pay, and B, new kit, new clothes and new weapons. And they failed to have their rendezvous, and I think it was Memphis. And so the father, we don't have a correspondence from the two of them, but we have the letters that arrived in Elephantine. From the dad, and the dad says, "I'm terribly sorry. I tried to get your back pay. I was fobbed off by these officials, and I missed with the clothes and everything. And they'll be waiting for you when you get back to Elephantine. And then he does a fantastic swerve, which sort of the millennium disintegrated, because my father used to do this. When he felt slightly shifty, he would immediately say, well, my boy, and this is exactly what he said, since you went south, my heart's not been so good, really. So he started with guilt trippery. And then he says, and I say in the book, he then uses the 3 words in Aramaic from which virtually all of Jewish history unfolds. He said, my heart's not so much good. Then the 3 words are simply, likewise, your mother. What are you going to say to that? Nothing. It's okay, Dad. It's all right. I need clothes. Who needs to pay anyway? So the Elephantine record is really remarkable. It's remarkable also not just for being a daily record of social life and something that was very new to me. I knew that the archive existed. I didn't know that the town existed. We were lucky. We got Egypt in one of its lulls, and we were we were accompanied everywhere by government minders and men with very large guns. But it was in a kind of lull, and it's an amazing place if you do get a chance to see it, is because I sort of thought, as often, biblical archaeology on it is mostly kind of rubble. You have to use a lot of imagination to get back to what it might have been, but not Elephantine, where there are really whole streets built of mud bricks and alleyways and hearths and stables, and it's a most extraordinary place. And what it spoke to, really, to me, is an intrinsic part of what I wanted to do. In other words, to say that Jewish history has not actually been as separate from the rest of the world. There is this divided issue inside Jewish history. On the one hand, some of what, whether it's chosen people stuff or whatever, we feel our peculiar identity in having been saddled with this great gift or difficulty of the Torah. On the other hand, of course, from Abraham on, the Bible says, light unto the nations. The implications of the ethical norms we lay down, going all the way to Hillel, remember, Rabbi Hillel was asked to explain the entirety of the Torah while standing on one leg, and he said, do not do unto others what is hateful to you. A sentiment plagiarized by Jesus of Nazareth shortly afterwards. And all of those norms were meant to be universalized, without any question universalized. So this inward-outward dichotomy, this sense of being our own people, but also entirely embedded, look, we're here in the United States, entirely embedded and imprinted by the cultures in which we live, is as important as the kind of separate special identity. And that was the case in Egypt as well. But I'm going to show you now a short clip from another huge surprise, a site nobody knows about, so I'm going to show it to you. Hold on, Zach. And it's what we don't have, from the Book of Maccabees, that whole Hasmonean period, is all of us kids and all of us here were brought up to celebrate Hanukkah as Jews and Greeks, totally opposite worlds. Not so. Jews spoke Greek, they dressed like Greek, they're dressed like Greeks, they wrote Greek kind of plays. The one figure in the relationship between the Jews and the Macedonian monarchies in Syria and Egypt, who was deranged, was indeed Antiochus Epiphanes. But he was really an exception. Once he was got rid of, the Hasmoneans not only called themselves by Greek names, King Alexander Yaneus, not all of them were, but he was the most powerful at the time. But they also were perfectly happy to be a satellite state, paying tribute to the Seleucid king of Syria again, because the Seleucid kings of Syria allowed Judaism to be practiced perfectly as it had been practiced forever. So what happened was an extraordinary kind of fusion of styles, of architectural styles. There is almost no Hasmonean building except for the tombs in the Valley of Kidron, as you've been to Jerusalem, and the so-called Zechariah tomb, the so-called Absalom tomb. They're all really dating from the 1st century BC. But we actually found this extraordinary place. It belonged to a family who'd originally been Idumean, and not ethnically Judean, but became completely converted to Judaism. And they were so Jewish that they married into the families of the high priests. And one of them who's described in both Josephus and in the Maccabees was the man called Tobias, who a tax collector for the Ptolemaic king of Egypt. and who had a kind of extraordinary sort of robber baron. He was a kind of oligarch. And he built this extraordinary building you're going to see, which is about halfway between Amman and the Dead Sea, his own little Jewish Arab empire. And it is a kind of perfect if you want to know what Greek Hasmonean building looked like, it's a completely neglected site, everybody, and it's an absolutely ravishing piece of architecture. But how Jewish is it in the sense of being part of the world of words? That's unclear. So can you run that clip for me, Zach?
Spectacular palace, 40 miles east of Jerusalem, was built in the 2nd century BC for a rich Jewish family, the Tobias, who made a pile collecting taxes for the Greek government in Egypt, but it was still kosher enough to marry into the family of the high priest. Their cash brought them an authentic Jewish classical masterpiece, a combination of grace and power. Like the Tobias, many Jews were seduced by Hellenism. Some even went through the painful operation of reverse circumcision,
You don't
an
know how
eye-watering procedure involving weights and pulleys, so that they could appear without embarrassment alongside the body-worshipping Greeks in the gymnasium. More significantly, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, an important bridge that connected Judaism to the wider world. But although individual Jews could cross that bridge, and many did, Jewish identity itself could not, if it was to remain distinctly Jewish. You could build yourself an elegant palace in the latest Greek fashion. You could speak Greek, you could dress like a Greek, you could read the Bible translated into Greek. You could even tell yourself that Plato and the Greek philosophers must have read Moses the Lawgiver. But in the end, an absolute fusion of the two cultures was actually impossible. Zeus was not a beefier version of the Jewish god, and the favorite residence of that god was not a limestone palace, but a house of words.
Okay, comes like that. I'm just going to show you one more clip, and then I won't get out of here alive. I don't have questions, actually. My favourite moment of Jewish questions was when I gave a rather grand academic lecture many years ago now to somebody I used to know, a great historian of the Middle East called Eli Kederi. And it was at the British Academy, a very grand place in London. And it was about, he grew up in Iraq, and he was a young man, teenager I think actually, during a terrible pogrom in 1941 called the Farhud. And I talked about that and the effect it may have had on his rather bleak view of history. And one of my ex-students actually was the introducer, and took questions afterwards. And I could see that this was not the usual British Academy crowd, that it was full of, my co-religionists, and we asked for questions, and from the back you could just see a hand. It was like, going to Florida, and it looks like all those cars, there's no one driving them, they're very small old Jews, who make what Jerry Seinfeld calls an eventual left turn, And so the small man arose and he said, and I had the finger immediately, he said, "You said that the Farhud started in such and such a bit of Iraq." He said, "Well, I have to tell you that my uncle Mendel was actually in Baghdad at that particular moment. It didn't stop." And before you finish your sentence, another hand rose. A little old lady got up and said, "My Auntie Esther knew your Mendel. He didn't know anything at all." Hell broke loose, actually. This was not the question time the British Academy is expecting. So I'll have a few questions. I just want to show you one more, because Jewish history is stained with tears, but it's not, there was one synagogue in Slovakia that we went to. This is in the 4th program, which is about Hasidism, and also ends actually in America, as you'll see. This is the opening of the program. And it looks at first sight, as you'll see, a very, very desolate place. But I was very struck, many of the things I've been talking to you tonight were really apparent in this extraordinary synagogue. It's full of colour, it's full of life. And not least, which I don't say in the film, there had to have been a collaboration between the Jewish and the non-Jewish world, because the windows are obviously kind of Bohemian, Slovakian, art moderne, glorious, glorious windows. And so the kind of, the exuberant joy of the place, as well as its desolation, made itself felt. And, I've set before you life and death, so choose life. We'll just play this last one. Do you know what I mean? The one, it's not the, yes, it's the next one down. So
Yes.
That was von Oscar. Yeah. That's great. And I'll stop then and let you attack me. Make sure we can get it. Okay. There we go. Sound up a little bit, or is that it?
This is it.
At first, it seemed like a place of utter desolation. But then I saw them, the stylized angels' wings hovering over the ceiling. Out of the dust burst the colors, the blues of heaven, the reds of the kings of Judah, the rainbows coming through the glass. And then, amidst all this absence, I began to sense the presence, the cantor's chant, the murmuring banter. And there in the galleries were the women of Jewish koshitze, and down below the men in silks and hats. In the spring of 1944, 15,700 Jews from Košice, the entire community, were sent to their deaths in Auschwitz. But this wasn't a place that sat passively, waiting for its death sentence. Before the Holocaust, Košice, like thousands of Jewish towns and villages strung across Central and Eastern Europe, was alive, thriving, confident, noisy. The opera and the klezmer, the schnorrer beggars and the prosperous merchants, the pushcart peddlers and the street corner revolutionaries. That this world somehow flourished despite all the pounding storms that would come its way is an escape act so epic that it counts as one of history's all-time redeeming miracles. Even when systematic annihilation overwhelmed the people, the world that had nourished them survived. This is the story about how this unique culture of faith, ferment, of poetry and music, of a search for deliverance from brutality and oppression, did not get pulverized by the hammer of history. It just changed its address.
So we have time for very few questions, because I'd love to meet as many of you as I can at the signing. So maybe a couple of questions. If you've got any, let's say. If you don't, we'll stop praying. Yes, lady. Yeah.
I was interested in what you said about your first book that nobody knows about the Rothschild.
Right.
We all have family history,
Right.
and we all have something in Eastern Europe. How do we find out? Like, I was told that my great-grandfather was part of the Rothschild settlement. That's in Rosh Pina.
In Rosh Pina?
In Rosh Pina.
Oh, okay. Well.
The first one. And he was supposedly the rabbi for the settlement.
Okay. Well, they all have great records. You go to the Central Zionist Archive.
That's what I wanted to know.
Yeah, and you also may want to go to, there's the archive I was working on was called Palestine Colonization Association, or PICA. It was also, there's also one called If you email me at simonmschama@gmail.com, I can tell you that actually, if you know Rosh Pina and you know,
I know he was in Rosh Pina, but I don't know.
before the First World War, we're talking about very early
We're
on,
talking about 1800, late
1890s.
Yeah.
You will find out. I can tell you. I'll give you. Email me and I'll tell you where to go. Yeah, you should be able to find out.
Because I love,
Yeah.
as you, finding the family
Right,
and finding
right.
the tradition.
Right. No, I think you'll have luck. Yeah. Yeah, gentlemen here. Yeah.
How do you see the Jewish identity being preserved as it becomes more philosophical and less theological?
Whoa, if only. Orthodoxy has been a stupendous success story. I mean, what I thought you were going to say was that you're either super Orthodox and very clearly in your own mind and everybody else is Jewish, or you're doomed to assimilation. Well, maybe that's what you were kind of implying. But maybe, California is not. If you're in New York, you would say Orthodoxy and the core of the religion is in, feverishly exuberant. It's a great success, really. It's been, I suppose, a surprising success. The same would be true in Israel, wouldn't it? But I mean, the real answer is that this has been a complaint. It's true that numbers are shrinking wherever you look, but it's been a complaint, ever since Philo of Alexandria, actually. And the answer is that, in the enormously amorphous grey area of philosophical engagement, you're absolutely right. And what I inevitably much more vaguely define as cultural memory, there is a huge amount of liveliness and vitality. A place called JY3, a Jewish cultural centre, has just opened in London, and non-Jews have flocked there as well as Jews, and it's open every single night, and it couldn't be more flourishing. There's the great Limud tradition. I think there's a Limud in America as well, which is kind of 4-day long weekend of enormous number of activities that range from sort of Hebrew and Yiddish instruction through to contentious debates about Israel. So Jewish Book Week, it's staggering there isn't a Jewish Book Week. Is there one in California? There's not one in New York, there is one. It's a stunning success in London. It is thousands and thousands of people, not many of whom are Jews, go to Jewish Book Week. Every single year. It's just grown and grown and grown. And so, the answer is there is no recipe. The answer, I like to think, is get stuck into projects like this that both energize Jews. I mean, I had one of the most touching things, actually, about the series in Britain was I had so many emails and actually personal encounters with half-Jews, quarter-Jews, shadow Jews, and a number of Jews who were children of people who come over on the Kinder transport in the 1930s, and whose parents had decided not to tell their children they were Jewish. Madeleine Albright's story. And they said to me, thank you, and this sounds horribly self-congratulatory, it really isn't meant to be, but they were kind enough to sort of thank me for finding a way which wasn't dauntingly orthodox or vacuously simply about lox and bagels, to actually get engaged. And a good friend of mine is a very famous writer who has to be nameless. I mean, I bumped into, and he's certainly Jewish and from Central Europe, from Czechoslovakia, and I bumped into him into the dentist, and wordlessly, he gave me this huge bear hug and said, "You're the first person who's explained me to me." And I don't, again, it sounds grotesquely conceited to put it like that, but it's no good kind of just wringing one's hands and saying, especially in America, it's not necessary because there are so many ways you can be Jewish in America. The thing is to do something concrete, to actually produce something. So the story goes on, to make the story go on. Okay, Mistress Melissa?
Yes, we have the books at the registers, and I know that Simon is happy to sign,
Yes,
so
indeed.
come on up and we'll sign at the table. And thank you.